At first glance, it looks like just another celebrity feud, another rapper taking shots, another documentary stirring up old drama. But as the narrator begins laying out the story, it becomes clear very quickly that this situation runs much deeper than internet jokes or long-standing rivalries. The video opens by questioning why 50 Cent, someone known for moving strategically, would suddenly invest so much time and energy into exposing Diddy through a multi-part documentary. The narrator emphasizes that this wasn't a rushed decision or a random act of provocation. Something triggered this shift, something personal. The audience is reminded that when someone like 50 Cent makes a move this public, this calculated, it's usually because he knows more than he's saying. Viewers are subtly prepared for the idea that the documentary they watched may only represent the surface layer of a much bigger story. The narrator frames the situation as unfinished business, hinting that what didn't make it into the final cut may be even more damaging than what did. And just as that idea settles in, the narrator leaves the audience with a lingering thought. If this is only what was allowed to be shown, what was considered too dangerous to release? The narrator then shifts focus to 50 Cent's own words, explaining that the Netflix documentary was originally meant to include far more material than what viewers saw. According to 50, there simply wasn't enough room to fit everything into 4 episodes. But the narrator makes it clear that time constraints might be an oversimplification. Among the claims left out was an allegation involving Diddy secretly having a child with a woman who once had a close connection to Tupac Shakur. The narrator explains why this specific detail matters so much, not just because of the secrecy, but because of the symbolism tied to Tupac's legacy. This wasn't just gossip. It was the kind of claim that could reopen decades-old wounds and reignite unresolved tensions. The narrator points out that 50 Cent hinted at possibly releasing this unused footage online, where there would be no network executives or corporate filters. That possibility alone changes the stakes. The audience is guided to understand that the documentary may have been intentionally restrained, not because the story lacked substance, but because it had too much of it. And as the narrator transitions forward, one thing becomes clear: missing footage is rarely missing by accident. The narrator then introduces comedian and industry insider T.K. Kirkland, whose perspective reframes the entire conflict. According to TK, many fans are misunderstanding why 50 Cent is so invested in this situation. This wasn't about clout, ego, or headlines. It was about boundaries. The narrator carefully explains TK's argument. Out of all the women in the world, Diddy chose to get involved with the mother of 50 Cent's child. In certain circles, that decision carries heavy meaning. The narrator breaks down why this act is viewed as deliberate disrespect, especially considering the long-standing tension between the two men. This wasn't ignorance, this wasn't coincidence. It was a move made with full awareness of the consequences. The narrator emphasizes that Diddy had limitless options, which only strengthens the idea that this choice was intentional. To many, it wasn't just crossing a line, it was erasing it entirely. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The narrator subtly reinforces that personal betrayal often fuels far more dangerous outcomes than professional rivalry ever could. From there, the narrator zooms out and begins connecting dots that many viewers may have overlooked. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the years, Diddy has repeatedly been linked to women who previously had relationships with other high-profile figures. The narrator explains how names like Tupac and others keep resurfacing in these stories, creating the impression of a recurring pattern rather than random coincidence. This pattern, the narrator suggests, appears to center around control, dominance, and proximity to rivals through personal relationships. Each example on its own could be dismissed, but taken together, they form something harder to ignore. The narrator emphasizes that patterns don't prove intent, but they do raise questions. And in this case, the questions are uncomfortable. The audience is encouraged to consider whether these choices reflect personal insecurity, strategic behavior, or something even deeper. Just as that thought begins to settle, the narrator pivots again, reminding viewers that the controversy didn't stop with the subject of the documentary itself. The narrator introduces Gene Deal, someone who claims the documentary itself may not be as original as it appears. According to Gene, key ideas and narrative structures were taken from him without acknowledgement. The narrator walks the audience through Gene's frustration, explaining that he believes the producers already knew exactly what story they wanted to tell because he had laid it out for them. This accusation adds another layer of controversy, not against Diddy, but against the project meant to expose him. The narrator explains why this matters. If parts of the documentary were reshaped, repackaged, or selectively edited, then viewers may not have received the full truth. Gene's skepticism about the cut for time explanation further deepens the doubt. The narrator presents this not as a definitive verdict, but as another crack in an already fractured narrative. And once again, the story grows more complicated rather than clearer. The narrator then addresses a question many people quietly asked but few openly discussed. If the documentary was so damaging, why wasn't it stopped? According to Gene Deal, if Diddy still had the level of influence people assume, the project would have been shut down immediately. The narrator explains that no cease and desist order came, no emergency injunction, no last-minute cancellation. To Gene, that silence speaks volumes. It suggests that whatever power once existed behind the scenes may no longer be absolute. The narrator walks the audience through the implication that the industry landscape has shifted and old shields may not work the way they used to. This realization reframes the documentary as a test of limits, not just a piece of media. And if those limits weren't enforced this time, the narrator hints that future releases could push even further. The narrator then focuses on one of the most noticeable omissions in the documentary, Kim Porter. Despite being a central figure in Diddy's personal life for years, her story was barely explored. The narrator explains why this absence raised immediate questions among viewers. Kim wasn't just a partner, she was someone who witnessed everything up close. According to various claims, she may have been preparing to release her own account of what she experienced. The narrator carefully explains that her passing, officially ruled as natural causes, has long been surrounded by speculation. By avoiding her story, the documentary may have sidestepped its most sensitive subject. The narrator emphasizes that silence can sometimes speak louder than testimony, and in this case, it left many viewers wondering what truths were considered too dangerous to touch. The narrator then brings in disturbing accounts from individuals like Mark Curry, who described intense control and monitoring within Diddy's relationships. The narrator explains claims of phone surveillance, violent confrontations, and situations that were publicly explained away. These stories paint a picture that contrasts sharply with the public persona many people recognize. The narrator is careful not to present these accounts as proven facts, but as recurring allegations that share striking similarities. The audience is reminded that patterns of behavior, when reported by multiple independent voices, demand attention. The narrator underscores how these stories add emotional weight to the questions left unanswered by the documentary. The narrator then shifts towards psychological context, drawing from Jaguar Wright's commentary about Diddy's childhood environment. The narrator explains how early exposure to instability, adult behavior, and constant outside influences can shape perception long before fame enters the picture. According to Jaguar, the foundations of later behavior may have been laid decades earlier. The narrator carefully frames this not as an excuse, but as context. Understanding where someone comes from does not absolve responsibility, but it can explain repetition. This perspective invites the viewer to see the story not as isolated scandals, but as a continuous line stretching back to the very beginning. In the final section, the narrator brings the story full circle by addressing concerns about the next generation. Allegations that children were exposed to inappropriate environments raise the most troubling questions of all. The narrator explains why this is where many people draw the line. If cycles repeat, it's because no one intervenes. The video closes by reminding viewers that documentaries don't end stories, they start conversations. And in this case, the conversation is far from over. The narrator leaves the audience with one final thought. If this is only the first wave of what may be released, then what comes next could change how this entire story is remembered.